So you will see a notification about the recording now. And now I'll introduce our speaker. I can go on for at least an hour introducing Gary, but for right now, I figure I will stick to just saying that Gary is the founding director of START, and he was recently awarded the Distinguished University Professor at the Department of Criminal Justice and Criminology at the University of Maryland, which is UMD's highest honor. Gary, you can take it away.
Okay, thanks so much, Erin. So as you can see on the screen, the title of my talk, Comparison Political Violence by Left, Right, and Islamist Extremists in the US and the World. And this project is very much a collaborative project involving not just myself, but Katerina Yasko from Jagiellonian University, Jim Piazza from Penn State, and Michael Becker from the University of Maryland. I don't know if any of them are online now to correct my mistakes, but want to make sure I give them credit. Let's go to the first slide if we can, Erin. So what really motivated this research was thinking about differences, initially at least, between right and left-wing violence when it comes to terrorism and political protest. So we have a slide here that shows on the left-hand side a right-wing organization. On the right-hand side of your screen, you see a left-wing, and you know, both with possibilities of violent clashes and lots of energy and potential conflict. If you just hit the next button, Erin. So the question that motivated this research to begin with is, are there systematic differences between ideologies in their readiness to use violence to make or to attain their political goals? So let's hit the next slide. So there's been quite a lot of interest in this topic for many years, particularly when we contrast general thinking of the left and the right. For example, there's an interesting study by Barbera and colleagues on Twitter feeds, where they look at ideological preferences of 3.8 million Twitter users and nearly 150 million tweets. You can see in the schematic that draws, you see these kind of bright spots in the middle. This represents a kind of different reaction by right-wing and left-wing individuals with regard to the kind of political communication they're tweeting about. And if you hit the next slide, Erin, maybe hit it twice even, you can see that, you know, the slide on the left shows a close-up of this Twitterverse, basically, where you can see that there's this big separation between left and right-wing supporters when it comes to the Twitterverse. And based on the right-hand side of this table, and this is not based on Twitter data, but on survey data from Pew, you can see that back in 1994, the researchers asked people to respond to a 10-point scale on political values, and then sent it out to Democrats and Republicans. So on the far left, you've got consistently liberal, on the far right, consistently conservative. You can see in the slide in 1994, there's a fair amount of overlap. There are distinct means that are different for Democrats and Republicans, but still quite a bit of overlap. And if you move to the right, you see in 2004, this overlap had declined. There's you know, more of a gap between Democrats and Republicans. If you move back to 2014, you can see now that, you know, it very much defines this polarized age we live in, where there's a huge gap between the sort of liberal and conservative viewpoints. And this cuts off in 2014. I assume if Pew had data up to the present, these differences would be even more pronounced. So there's this real interest in, you know, this gap between right-wing and left-wing sentiments. And this paper is basically about looking at whether this makes a difference when it comes down to measuring violence. So Erin, could you give us the next slide, please? One more, I guess. So what do we expect from these comparisons of the far right and the far left? Well, the far right, the arguments that the far right would be more violent than the far left, there are quite a few of them. One is the idea that when we test individuals on the far right, they pretty consistently show up as being more closed-minded, more dogmatic. They have what psychologists call a greater need for order, a greater need for closure. They like structure. They like things that are clear-cut and obvious. They also tend to be very motivated by threats, and they have a tendency towards authoritarianism and relationships based on social dominance. And they have a lot of prejudice and a lot of hostility to outgroups. So if we hit the next slide. On the other hand, there's a lot of reasons why we might expect differences on the left, that the left are often characterized as more open to new experiences, that they are more comfortable with complexity, with cognitive complexity, that they have a greater tolerance for uncertainty than people on the right, that they are more in favor of egalitarian systems and egalitarian social arrangements, and that they're more concerned than people on the right about doing harm to others and being sure that our systems are fair. So you have these arguments that would suggest that perhaps the far right is more violent than the far left. So if we go to the next slide, Aaron. Oh, by the way, this is called by some the rigidity of the right hypothesis. So psychologist Yost and his colleagues have made this argument. What about arguments that the far right is as violent as the far left? In other words, that there's no difference between the two. If you hit the next button, Aaron. So one thing that concerns us is it's pretty clear, pretty well known that social science tends to be biased against right-wing ideologies. Certainly, there's a lot of research in universities which suggests that there are way more liberals than conservatives on college campuses and in universities in general. Universities are in large part the people doing the research on these topics. Maybe they're just biased against the right wing. There's also quite a bit of research that says, you know, liberals like conservatives if they are being asked questions that are close to their heart, that deal with moral values, with ethical issues. They can be very intense and perhaps with similar intensity to conservatives and right-wing supporters. There's also arguments that they're equally likely to defend against violations and threats when their worldview is being questioned, that the left is just as extreme as the right when it comes to protecting things that they really believe in. And there's a number of people who've made this argument, but the psychologist Brandt and his colleagues in 2014 refer to this as the ideological conflict hypothesis. So you have these two different perspectives, one that would lead us to think the right would be more violent, one to argue that the right and left might be very similar. If we go to the next slide. And there's actually some research, I think, suggesting that the right and left would be more similar. If you imagine, as I've got on this screen, a situation where on the you've got two axes. On the y-axis, you've got a table that runs from liberals show more intolerance to conservatives show more intolerance. On the x-axis, you've got groups that are perceived as strongly liberal or strongly conservative. So if you then ask conservatives and liberals about their tolerance towards groups rated as either conservative, so some group like a Christian fundamentalist, or liberal, perhaps a group like a feminist, what sort of results do you get? And we see this in the next slide. You see that basically you have a whole bunch of cases where conservatives are more intolerant of liberal groups. If you look at the top end, they're more intolerant of atheists, of labor unions, of gays and lesbians, of blacks, of Chicanos, Hispanics. But at the same time, liberals are more intolerant of conservative groups, so more intolerant of the military, business people, Christian fundamentalists, etc. So again, this suggests that perhaps there isn't much difference in the relative use of violence from the right and the left. So can we have the next slide now, Aaron? So it's somewhat surprising when we've got into this work, particularly for all of you who are calling in from START, where a lot of work relating to this topic goes on, and the data we're going to be talking about is completely curated at START. You'd think that there'd be a lot of research on this topic, that it'd be a kind of resolved issue, because it seems like a very important one in terms of policy. But actually, the prior research is quite limited when you really start digging down into it. For one thing, most of it's been done by psychologists, and much has been done in experimental settings. So in other words, you'll get a random sample of, say, college students or the public at large, and you ask them questions about, you know, are you conservative, or are you liberal, and how willing would you be to use violence? But this is it's lacking in what we would call external validity, that, how realistic is this? So you're looking at people who have not engaged in actual political behavior that's either violent or nonviolent. Oftentimes they have, no personal experience with a group. In most cases, of course, if you pick a random sample, you're not going to get many people who've been actively involved in political violence, certainly, or in terrorist causes. You have very little extremism in this group because they're randomly sampled. And what's our third one there, Aaron? And also, you're leaving out, I've said nothing so far about, one of the very important ideologies when it comes to certainly terrorism over the last 20 years, and that's Islamist groups. So this work has pretty much excluded Islamist groups. How do they fit in? Are they different than right wing? Are they different than left wing? Are they more similar to one or the other? There just hasn't been much research that compares them side by side and sort of figures out how they should be counted. So that's the sort of background to this research. Let's go to the next slide, please. So we need to then come up with a way of categorizing these. And we'll start with Islamist extremists because they have not fit into this extensive literature on whether the right or the left is more extreme. And we could argue that Islamists, we'd expect them to be closer to the far right because they overlap in some ways. They tend to be conservative. You look at certainly groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda. They're obviously high in religious fundamentalism. When we do tests of people in this area, that they come out as very strong in terms of dogmatism, authoritarianism, a need for closure, and so on, which makes us think that they would be more like the far right than the far left. On the other hand, if you look at these groups, if we take the next slide or the next, yes, thanks, Aaron. We look at these groups, they also, though, have some similarities, one would think, to leftist ideologies. After all, a lot of the potence of Islamism is based on collective grievances, the feeling that that they're being mistreated and not treated fairly. There's oftentimes in the literature from Islamism, there's a big focus on inequality, on disadvantage. There's certainly a sense of injustice, and a lot of dialogue about that the system is stacked against a fundamental Islamist viewpoints. So there's some argument that you might expect also Islamists to resemble the far left. Okay, if we could have the next slide. So for the present study, we were specifically interested in what's the relationship between ideology and violence. So we wanted to do a systematic comparison of the far right, the far left, and Islamist extremists. But unlike virtually all of the prior research, we're not going to do this in an experimental setting. We want to actually use people who have been directly connected, people in groups, I should say, who've been directly connected to either engaging in violent or nonviolent extremism. And so to do this, no better place to start than the START Center. So this research is based on two databases that have been at START for many years now. One of them on the United States, which is called PIRUS, and I'll give a brief overview of this in just a second. And another that's been at START since the beginning of START, actually, called the Global Terrorism Database, which tracks terrorism worldwide. So we want to look at violence from these two databases, one that concentrates on the United States, one that looks worldwide. And we obviously also, this is a non-experimental setting, so we want to control for a bunch of as many rival explanations as we can, or what we call covariates. So we want to look at, do ideologies differ in terms of violence in these two databases, and do they still differ even when you control for a lot of differences within those categories? So let's look at the next slide. So let's talk a little bit about the databases. I know for many of you on this call, I'm probably speaking to the choir. In fact, I'm guessing some of you are working on these databases. So thanks so much for the work you're doing on this. PIRUS, of course, stands for Profiles of Individual Radicalization in the United States. It got underway in about, I believe, 2012, somewhere about then. So it's been going on for about 10 years now. It's collected at the START Center. The funding for PIRUS has come, I think, entirely from the National Institute of Justice. And the PIRUS team is led by Mike Jensen. And the next bullet, please. It was created originally when the Pirates data got underway back about 10 years ago. It was very difficult to do large-scale quantitative analysis of extremists in the United States because there just wasn't any reputable data to look at. So one of our big reasons for putting this data set together was to give a large N data set that could be used to study terrorism and radicalization, but from a quantitative empirical perspective. The next bullet, please. So as most of you on this call probably will know, PIRUS is based on non-classified data, secondary sources, relies especially on court records and newspaper reports, both print and electronic media, to some extent also biographies and declassified government sources. And it's coded by a team led by Mike Jensen. And I suspect maybe we even have some people on this call that are working on PIRUS. So let's go to the next. Again, for those of you who are not familiar with PIRUS, the way you get into the PIRUS database is a number of different routes. If you've been arrested for a crime having to do with terrorism, if you've been indicted for a crime having to do with terrorism, if you've been killed in action relating to some incident of terrorism, if you're a member of a designated terrorist organization, or you're part of a group whose leadership is a member of a terrorist organization, you can get into the PIRUS database, basically. So the sample we're looking at, PIRUS is a living database, so the sample keeps changing over time as new studies add to the data. But the study I'm going to talk about today is based on 1,563 individuals. They all radicalized predominantly in the United States to the point of committing whatever ideologically motivated act that got them into the PIRUS database. And these acts, some of these acts are violent and some of them are nonviolent. In just a second, I'll explain what we mean by those two terms. Let's have the next bullet, please, Aaron. It's overwhelmingly male, the database, about 90% men, about 11% women. Next bullet point, please. The average age at exposure. So in other words, by age at exposure, we mean the thing that gets you into PIRUS. The average age is about 35, which, you know, for our criminologists on the call, this is a bit older than you would expect from a criminal population. There's been some research showing, in fact, that extremists tend to be a bit older than more ordinary kinds of offenders. The ideological categories in PIRUS break down about 59% right, about 23.4% left, and the remaining 17.6% Islamist. And I'll return to this point in just a second, because we'll see in just a second when we get to the worldwide data that there are way more, there's a much higher proportion of far right in the United States than in the world at large. Okay, let's do the next slide. So it's important, you know, because the main point of this presentation is to look at how ideology affects violence. So we should spend a little bit of time defining ideology, and it's complicated. In fact, I could direct people, if you really want to get down into the weeds on this, you can go to the START website, and under PIRUS and under the GTD, well, I guess under PIRUS only, if you go to the code book, you'll see how ideology is coded. And I'm going to sort of gloss over this because we don't want to spend the whole time describing this. But generally, what we mean by far right is what we would call an exclusivist ideology that favors social hierarchy. Individuals that have antipathy either to left-wing causes or to the federal government, or both. And individuals who are linked to extremist religious groups, to non-religious racial supremacists, tax protesters, and militant gun rights advocates. So in this category, we've got groups like the Aryan Brotherhood, we've got groups like the Third Continental Congress, the Three Percenters, Sovereign Citizens, and so on. Can we do the next slide? For the far left, we're instead looking at individuals who are economic class oriented, socioeconomically focused. They are anti-imperialist. They reject the hegemony of the current ruling classes internationally as well as nationally. And this includes elements of Marxism as well as eco and animal rights activists. So a pretty diverse group here as well. If we could have the next slide. For Islamists, we're looking at individuals who are motivated by a goal to establish an Islamic political system. But in the United States context, this plays out in a specific way. Most of the Islamists in our data are not attempting to establish an Islamist political system in the United States, but rather they're targeting the governments of majority Muslim countries from the US, or targeting the US in retaliation for its foreign policies towards those majority Muslim countries. So they're still interested in the concept of a caliphate, but not necessarily in the United States, but elsewhere. Okay, let's do the next slide. And just very briefly, a very crude sketch that these three groups vary over time. And this is going to be important as I get to the end of the presentation in terms of interpreting the results. You can see basically the far left was the dominant ideology in Pyrrhus from the beginning of the coding, which is back in the 40s, all the way to about the mid-1970s. Then the far right really takes off, becomes the dominant group from the mid-70s until about the mid-1990s. And Islamist groups kind of come out of nowhere and start to really ramp up in the 90s and especially after the 2000s. So there's a temporal dimension to these ideological preferences too that we're going to want to control for. Okay, could we have the next slide, please? So as I say, what we're trying to do is predict violence here. What do we mean by violence? Basically, we mean the same thing that criminology means. So we use the essentially the FBI's definition of violent crimes. So we're looking at violence as being murder, assault, armed robbery, and kidnapping. And nonviolent behavior, we're looking at things like money laundering, providing weapons to an extremist group, illegal weapons possession, and tax fraud. And I think there's another bullet on the end of this, yes. So I should point out that we try in Pyrrhus to measure intention. So in other words, behavior that's perpetrated with the intention to cause death or injury, we count as violent even if it's unsuccessful. So that does come up in a number of cases. And so it's important to keep that in mind. So what are we going to try to control for? What are our covariates? Well, we're obviously interested in age. We know that, as you could see from the previous slides, that there are differences in age in terms of participation in different terrorist organizations. We're going to control for gender. We have a control for race or ethnic minority status. We have a measure of whether or not the individual is an immigrant. We have education level in our models, so we look at less than high school, and more than high school. We control for marital status, and if you hit the next slide, there's a couple more control variables. We look at past experience with violence as well. So in other words, were you ever a member of the US military? It's a dichotomy, yes or no. And we have a measure of criminal activity. So ranging from no previous activity to previous nonviolent minor, previous nonviolent serious, and previous violent, to make sure that what we're picking up is not explained by criminal record. Okay, if we have the next slide. So as you could tell from the quick time chart I put up there, there is definitely variation in these ideologies over time. So to control for that, we looked at 6 decades, starting from all cases before 1970 and ending with cases to the 2010s. Next slide, please. I'll just provide a little bit of plain descriptive statistics to give you some idea of how the data shake out before we get to the main analysis. You can see if you just look at descriptively what's going on, there's pretty stark differences in terms of violence by the 3 categories. You can see far left at the descriptive level has less than 40% of far left cases in Pyrrhus are violent. Far right, it's about 60% are violent. And Islamist, it's pushing up to about 75%. So you can see this is a significant difference at the straight descriptive level between these categories. And just very briefly, if we go to the next slide, just a few of the characteristics you might find interesting. These are all covariates that we're going to include in our model, so I'm not going to dwell on this too much, but there are some interesting differences that leftists are more likely to be women, you can see in the first category. On the other hand, the far right is considerably more likely to be white. You can also see that, perhaps not surprisingly, Islamists are much more likely to be immigrants, whereas far left and far right more likely to be non-immigrants. You can see that leftists are more highly educated than far right and Islamists, and all of these are significant differences. If we go to the next slide, in terms of experience with violence, these numbers are way lower, of course, but note that the far right is way more likely to have had military experience. I mean, like 25% versus 5% for far left and Islamists. And if we take the next slide, you can also see these differences are not nearly as stark as the other demographic ones, but if you look at the far side, the violent crime, you can see that the far right does have significantly more experience with violent crime than either those who participate in far left or Islamist categories. Okay, let's get to the main event now. To do this analysis, we used a logistic regression analysis. And to keep things a little easier to keep up with, I've taken the covariates out of this. So we're looking only at ideology in this model, but we have the model that either controls for covariates or doesn't. And in this model, we're taking right-wing groups as a comparison group. So what you see in this model, if you look at the very last line where it says left-wing ideology, and you see that negative 1.15 and a significant 0.32. What this is telling you is that left-wing cases in PIRIS are significantly less violent than right-wing cases. And this relationship holds whether you include the covariates or not. You see it holds in both of these cases. Interestingly, Islamist ideology, although Islamists, as we saw in the descriptive chart, were somewhat more violent than right or left, they were not, when you control for all these other factors, they were not significantly different from the right wing. So our conclusion here is left wing is clearly less violent than both the right wing and Islamist terrorism. So let's very quickly, our main focus isn't on the covariates, but let's take a look at the covariates in the next slide. We can see in addition that individuals with an immigrant background were less violent, significant less violent, although barely significant. Barely significant also, white individuals were less violent, not by much, but by a little bit. You can see that previous violent criminal experience is associated with being significantly more violent. And I won't go into the details about the time variables, but we do find some differences over time in terms of how important violence is in the PIRIS data. Okay, let's turn to our next study. I'm calling this database 2, and this is based on the Global Terrorism Database. And again, I know I'm speaking to the choir for many of you on this call, and I'm guessing some of you have worked on the GTD. But for those of you who have not had much contact with the GTD, it's an open source, worldwide terrorist attack database. It relies, again, like PIRIS, primarily on print and electronic media. And it's been run by a team at START now for many years. It's led by Aaron Miller. GTD basically uses algorithms these days to collect the database. It starts with a universe of around 2 million articles published daily, and then has a staff of varying sizes, but somewhere in the area of 15 to 20 individuals and interns who then take these algorithms and turn them into the terrorism database. For this study, we examined cases in the GTD from 1970 to 2017. And we limited the sample of events to those that identified a perpetrator group, which knocks out, actually, those of you who work on GTD know this very well, that one of the biggest areas of missing data in the GTD is the perpetrator group. So that knocks out a fair number of cases. And we also thought it was wise to limit the study to perpetrators that are just sort of the serious ones. So we limit this analysis to perpetrators who had committed at least 5 or more attacks. So we sort of wanted to get rid of some of the random noise that might be caused by hitting the kind of one-note wonders. So we looked at eventually a sample of 534 separate perpetrator groups and spent a lot of time going through those perpetrator groups and ranking them in terms of whether they were predominantly right-wing, predominantly left-wing, or predominantly Islamist. Okay, if we go to the next slide. So the issues in study 2 are very similar to those in study 1. We tried to use the same definition of ideology that we used in study 1. 46% of the incidents were perpetrated by Islamist terrorists. Prominent examples include groups like the Islamic State or Hezbollah. 48% were perpetrated by left-wing terrorist groups such as Shining Path of Peru or the Naxalite movement of India. And 6% were perpetrated by right-wing terrorist groups such as the Ku Klux Klan in the US or the White Wolves movement in the UK. Again, we constructed 2 dichotomous variables with right-wing ideology being used as the reference category. So our results are going to be in reference to the right wing. Let's do the next slide. So to do this analysis, we relied on multi-level logistic regression. The dependent variable for this analysis is based on the notion that total fatalities are highly skewed in the GTD. The extreme example of this, of course, is 911, where you've got almost 3,000 deaths, where a large proportion of cases in the GTD, there are no deaths. So we've decided that the best way to proceed with the dependent variable is to dichotomize it. So essentially just look at whether anyone was killed or not, yes or no. And we found that there was at least one fatality in 54% of the attacks included in the GTD analysis. And just to put your mind at ease, though, we did run the analysis, treating it just as a continuous variable as well, as a robustness check. I can talk about this if anyone's interested. We did a zero inflated negative binomial model to deal with the fact that you get a highly skewed sample. And the good news is the results were the same, whether we did it that way or we used a dichotomous measure. So I'm going to just talk about the dichotomous measure here. Okay, let's do the next slide. We also, as in the first case, we wanted to control for as many covariates as possible. So we looked at the intensity of domestic civil conflict, how much other conflict is going on besides terrorism in the country being looked at. We looked at ethnic fractionalization, which some would say, the more fractionalization in society, the more conflict, including violence. We also looked at GDP, common control variable in this kind of work, log total population. And also because the ideologies in the GTD are different over time, just like they are in Pyrrhus, we wanted to control for time periods. So we have a measure of whether the attack happened before 1990, from 1990 to 2010, or post 2010. Oh, and I should say, I forgot to mention, you noticed in the previous slide that only 6% of the GTD sample was right-wing, compared to over 50% of the US sample, which I just note this in passing, that I think sometimes we lose sight of the fact of just how important the right wing is in the United States. And to some extent, at this stage of history at least, the US stands out in this regard compared to the rest of the world. Okay, let's go on to the results in the next slide. So the results are a little bit more complicated here because we had a fair amount of correlation between our covariates and our outcome variable. So when we did logistic regression that included all of the covariates, our models tended to blow up. So what we've done instead is developed 3 different models that include 3 different sets of control variables. But the same logic as we used in the Pyrrhus study that we just talked about. So in the first model, we control for the 2 conflict measures. So, whether there's civil conflict going on and whether there's fractionalization. Second model, we control for population and GDP. Third model, we control for time period. And I draw your attention again to the very bottom of the table, which shows left-wing ideology. And what you see here, again, is strong negative relationship. So this is telling us that compared to the right wing, the left wing is significantly less violent, even controlling for these different covariates. Now, to some extent different, though, from the Pyrrhus data, if you look above that, Islamist ideology ends up being significant and positive in the worldwide analysis. So in other words, at the worldwide analysis, Islamist ideology is significantly more violent than right wing, and certainly more violent than left wing. So you have a sort of rank order of most violent Islamists, then right wing, and then left wing. Let's go to the next slide, please. Just very quickly to talk about the covariates. We found that fatalities were higher when the attack occurred in the context of a civil conflict. We found that they were higher when ethnic fractionalization was higher. This is essentially a measure of how much friction there is between ethnic groups within a society. And finally, we found that fatalities were lower in countries with higher GDP, essentially in wealthier countries. Okay, let's take the next slide, please. So let me wind up with some discussion and conclusions, and I'll start with a very quick summary of our findings. We're finding that left-wing radicals in the United States were less likely to use violence than right-wing and Islamist radicals. If we hit the next bullet point, Aaron, please. And then based on a worldwide comparison, we find attacks motivated by left-wing groups were less deadly than attacks by either right-wing or Islamist groups. Next bullet. These substantive conclusions were not affected by the inclusion of control variables. And as you saw in both cases, when we add the covariates in the models, the results do not change. You still get these strong, significant relationships. And the next. And we find these findings are robust against fairly different databases. You know, PIRUS is a database that looks at individuals. It's limited to the United States. On the other hand, GTD is a worldwide database that tracks events as opposed to individuals. And so they're very different sorts of databases. And we're finding that the results from these two very different databases are quite similar. Next slide, please. So I should point out some limitations. And again, I think for many of you on this call, you will be very familiar with these limitations. Both databases suffer from missing data. This is a ongoing major issue with regard to open source data. However, I want to call your attention to an interesting fact about this, because I think we could argue there's a chance at least that this may actually strengthen our conclusion if at least the extraordinary attention generated by Islamist terrorism in recent years is to be believed. So in other words, if you imagine that the media are more vigilant in reporting Islamists compared to right or left-wing attacks, it might make Islamist cases appear less violent than they actually were. So if you follow me, why would that be the case? Well, because the media is sussing out less important issues because they think Islamist terrorism is more important than other forms of terrorism. Now, I can't prove this, obviously, but I think as a think piece, it suggests that we might actually have conservative results when you think about the missing data problem. A second limitation on PIRUS data collection, and to a lesser extent the GTD, is PIRUS only started collecting data in 2013. And we know that data erode over time. So PIRUS is likely to be much better at collecting data after 2013 than before 2013. But again, there's some reason to think that this could strengthen our results for the left-wing analysis. And try this thought experiment again. So let's imagine that we were less able to pick up left-wing cases in the 70s and 80s than other cases. Well, this is exactly, we see this is exactly when the left is most active. So if we're less likely to get left-wing cases, I would guess that the ones we're most likely to get are the ones that are not as dramatic. So, and that usually means those that kill no one or kill few people. So if we're getting less of the less violent cases from the left wing, we might actually have a more conservative test of this measure than you would expect based on the analysis we were actually able to do. And again, this is just supposition. I can't prove either of these, but I think it's an interesting thing to add to the discussion. Okay, next slide, please. Let's just sum up then. In the current polarized political climate in the US, I think, there's a tendency to assume that all strong ideological positions are equally violent. And after all, there's plenty of evidence that both liberals and conservatives are intensely supported by moral values, that they are willing to vigorously defend themselves, particularly if there's threats to their worldview or ethical standing. This is not what our analysis shows, however. We are showing that instead, for both the United States and the world, right-wing and Islamist terror attacks are significantly deadlier than left-wing terrorist attacks. If I could have the next slide, please. And I'll just conclude by going back to a couple of famous quotes from Brian Jenkins, the well-known terrorism researcher. In 1975, Brian famously noted that, quote, terrorists want a lot of people watching and a lot of people listening and not a lot of people dead. Well, based on our analysis, this observation is a decent characterization of left-wing terrorism for the past half century. Lots of people watching, lots of people listening, not a lot of people dead. And interestingly, it characterizes the period when Jenkins wrote this, which was the mid-1970s, when the most common type of terrorism in the United States was left-wing. 3 decades later, in 2006, Brian modified his original observation and concluded that many of today's terrorists want a lot of people watching and a lot of people dead. And again, based on our analysis, this observation is more in keeping with results for right-wing and Islamist terrorism over the past half century, where these kinds of cases have been far deadlier. So I think I will leave it at that. I've got some contact information on the next sheet here, and be happy to take any questions. And I'll have to check the Q&A here, I guess.
Great, Gary. Thank you so much. For our audience, I will remind you that if you have any questions for Gary, you're welcome to drop them in the Q&A, and we'll have a couple minutes now to answer them. I'll let folks kind of rapidly try to type as fast as they can into the Q&A box. Gary, if anyone does have any kind of follow-up questions after this, would you mind if they reached out to you?
Yes, not at all. That'd be fine, of course. And I do have one in the Q&A. Aaron, do you see this one as well?
Oh, yes. I have a whole bunch. Yay. So I think I'll start with why do leftist extremists tend to be older? Is there a reasoning or correlation?
That's a good question. I haven't seen anybody who's looked at that. And Joe, do you know? I guess you've probably looked at this. I mean, we are finding these significant demographic differences. Like, for example, leftists tend to be also more highly educated, which, you know, would sort of go with an older age. Great question. I don't have an answer to that, actually. I'm gonna have to push it back to you.
Great. So our next question comes to us from, of course, Martha Crenshaw. Good morning, Martha.
Yeah, hi, Martha. Good to hear from you.
Can you offer thoughts as to why these findings, why is the right more violent in the United States today?
Yes, so, well, of course, the results are a little different than that. We are finding that the right is more violent worldwide as well as in the US, but Islamists are even more violent than the right in the worldwide results, whereas that effect washes out in the US. I suspect part of the difference in the ranking of violence between Islamists and right wing has to do with the sample size, because as you could see from the descriptives, we have a relatively small sample from the from the world of right wing. It's much smaller than the cases for the US. So I think, you know, if you look just at the right left, though, the results do hold, Martha, for both the US and the world. Now, I guess the trickier question is asking, are they more extreme? And for that, we probably can't directly, it's probably to some extent, apples and oranges. We got different databases, different metrics, and so on. But the underlying issue is that they are similar in that in both cases, the left is considerably less violent.
I think one of our next questions will be, can you go back to your left-right Islamist classification? Is there a point where they overlap?
That's a great question. And I don't know if any of the Pyrus team is on this call, but I think one of the things that we've certainly been kicking around is would be interesting to unpack these broader categories. And Martha, who's on this call, has done some really interesting work already along these lines, because it could be that there is overlap, and there seems to be growing overlap. I'm looking at this unfortunate case that's just developed with Paul Pelosi, for example, where the guy's background does seem to have a kind of bizarre mixture of right and left. And I think it would be really interesting to look at that in more detail. And I think maybe we will get around to doing that. If you look at the right, for example, it includes a very diverse group of individuals. You've got, people that are interested in gun rights, abortion, people that have some sort of, vaguely anti or vaguely racist ideology. You've got people who are anti-federal. So it's a pretty diverse group, and we're combining all of those individuals. And even on the left too, you've got groups as different as those looking for free Puerto Rico versus ELF and ALF, and so some very different ideologies involved there as well. So I think it would be very useful to do more to unpack those and look at whether there are differences across those. And along the way, it would be very interesting, I think, to start looking at how much overlap do you get? How much do you get from people crossing across ideologies? And I'd be really interested to see is this increasing over time? Because I have a suspicion that it might be, that you're getting more of this overlap, perhaps in the social media age than we got in earlier periods. So that's a great question.
Yeah, I think, oh man, they're coming in fast. Let me see. I think the next question can be, could Pyrus provide data to determine the success of disengagement and de-radicalization programs?
Good question. I think the answer is yes. I think it could come up with suggestions. I think it's imperfect, however, but you certainly, I mean, we've had a number of projects, and actually Mike Jensen and the Pyrus team have published some of these as well, and some of them are on the START website, which is using Pyrus to look at sort of pushes and push and pull factors in terms of getting into terrorism. Now, an interesting feature of Pyrus along those lines, though, is all of the individuals in it are in for essentially acts of political violence or terrorism. It's just whether they're violent or nonviolent. So a lot of the work contrasts violent and nonviolent, not what gets you into the system to begin with. That's why I say it's not a perfect way of looking at the issues you're raising, but it's certainly part of the story.
Yeah. And let me see. So you mentioned that no Islamist groups are compared. Okay, actually, I think I'll hold off on that question for a second. I'm not sure what that question is asking. So we have one question. In Nigeria, we have a problem with Islamist terrorism, but there are also groups seeking to secede from the state growing in their use of violence. Do you think good political leadership reduces the choice of violence as a tool for achieving group objectives?
One would hope, right? And it's interesting to think about, the extent to which the U.S. is a bellwether in terms of these right-wing cases. We are starting to see an increase in right-wing extremism in other parts of the world, like in parts of Europe, Germany, for example. So it'll be interesting to see if similar dynamics are at play in places like Africa. I think it's probably too early to tell, but sure. I mean, I think governments should be certainly paying attention to this, and hopefully that would be a key goal of policymakers.
Thank you. So for my next question, I'll say, with the current trajectory, I can't help but wonder what direction we're headed in for the US and beyond. We seem to be seeing increased divisions and tensions, as shown by your slide on Democrat and Republican divergence since 1994.
Yeah, I think I'm sure many of the people on this call are concerned about exactly that issue. And one of the things that's hit me in terms of being affiliated with STAR for many years is that you get these kind of wave-like, and lots of course, terrorism researchers have made this point as well, that you tend to get this wave-like reaction when terrorism. So, if you start to see right-wing cases picking up, there's a real concern that that's going to escalate. We're not very good, I think, at predicting where the top of those waves are. But I think once you get into a wave, you have a natural, it's not a crazy prediction to think it's going to get worse before it gets better. So I think that's a huge issue. And it seems to be playing out not just on the legitimate political line as well. I mean, we're looking just at political violence and terrorism, but if you look at certainly the rise of right-wing political parties around the world, and example recently in Italy, and I guess Brazil may have dodged that. We'll see how that plays out. But you certainly have lots of examples of growing right-wing political movements that range from legitimate to what we're looking at, to actual political violence. And our data is already, a few years old. So our GTD data stopped in 2017. So things are moving pretty quickly here. So I think, it's a great and I think worrying question to be thinking about.
And our next question is, do you think the system of government, excuse me, do you think the system of government affects the prevalence of far left versus far right terrorism?
I do. I can't prove it, and we didn't look at it in this case, but I think others are beginning to look at it. It doesn't seem to be random that you're getting a big increase in the success of right-wing political parties, legitimate parties, and at the same time, it looks like an increase in political violence from the right. I mean, you would think, and I would assume that would probably work as well among left-wing parties, that you probably get. My guess would be that, if you have a movement, you've got, sort of legitimate law-abiding parts of that movement, and then a kind of spectrum going all the way down to non-law-abiding criminal elements of the movement. And it's, I would assume those probably go hand in glove. I was looking at the GTD data, and again, I can't prove this, but I've always been struck by the fact that the GTD data shows this huge decline in worldwide terrorism in 1991, which is exactly when the Soviet Union collapsed. And I think I've always thought a big part of that has been the decline in left-wing groups. So in other words, you have sort of legitimate political entities and non-legitimate violent entities operating in tandem, probably.
Okay, so I think one of our questions, what do you hope that this research does for the future of observing political ideologies as it relates to violence? You mentioned that it could help to predict violence in the future.
Yeah, so I think what's really important about this is, and maybe this might be uniquely, or maybe I'd say more prevalent in Western democracies, but I think our news reporting has this tendency to want to, and which is a good tendency in many ways, to balance reporting by representing both sides of a story. And that's fine in some regards if it's true. So, you often get a story, well, we'll get on the one hand, well, we've got the Proud Boys and the 3%ers and they're violent, but look at Antifa. But what if it's the case that Antifa and Elf and Alf just are not empirically as violent? I mean, that's an important issue to be aware of. So in other words, I think, we need to get the facts right. It's really important. And it doesn't mean that couldn't change. It could change in the future. People have been predicting that groups like Elf and Alf would get more violent for years. Hasn't happened yet. And so I think, if you're saying, okay, well, there's problems on both sides when it comes to violence. Well, maybe, but those problems could be quite different. So I think, that's an important part of policy, I think, to be aware of that.
Great. Let me see. Okay, I think, so this question is, were intimidation methods such as doxing considered when collecting the data? I think they mean inclusion in the databases.
There's no reason why they couldn't be if it fits the other parts of our model, basically. But my guess is, I think doxing has been coming to the fore much more recently. So you'd have to have, something that was serious enough involving doxing where, somebody did something serious enough to get them into the database, essentially. We certainly wouldn't exclude doxing, though, if the characteristics of the case fit the model.
And so one question is kind of about your motivations for the research. The question is, while the motivation of your research was finding if there were differences in the ways political goals are obtained based on ideologies to predict violence, where did your original motivation or interest in this topic come from?
Well, of course, my own specific interest, my background's in criminology, so I've long been interested in what predicts illegal violent behavior. And so I see terrorism as a piece of that, just like homicide and other kinds of violence. So that was kind of my original motivation. I got involved in this specific question, though, because I think I don't know how the folks working for GTD or Pyrus or the folks at START, but to some extent, I think if I talked to quite a few people at START and I said, who's more violent, right or left or Islamist, I would guess a lot of people said, oh, yeah, that's obvious, it's right, and or it's right and Islamist. I suspect a lot of researchers in this area might say that. But when we actually got into the literature, we realized that nobody had really tested that. It was a kind of an untested assumption. And furthermore, when you got into a lot of the literature, particularly from psychology, there was a lot of arguments and a lot of skepticism about that, because most of the work in psychology has been based on experimental data, not on actually people who've been associated with actual terrorist attacks, but ordinary individuals, either college students or samples of individuals. And you do find, you find much more of a balance between left and right attitudes when you're not looking at people who've actually engaged in terrorism. So it strikes me as that's not a good policy stance. And so I think more generally, the issue, psychology is fantastic at internal validity because they can do experiments. We can't do experiments very easily, but I think we're better at external validity because we're dealing with people who've actually been engaged in extremist movements. And so, I think there's probably room for both of those viewpoints. But interestingly, though, I don't think there's another study that has actually done this direct test before.
I think, let me see. So you mentioned that Twitter was one of the main platforms used to generate results. Or excuse me, I'm not sure what that question is asking either. So one of my questions is, my question is outside the scope of your study, but do you think the act of committing violence has a transformative effect on the ideology of the terrorist?
That's a great question. One of our colleagues at START some years ago, Rick McCauley, I doubt if he's on this call, but he did this really interesting thing to look at how the Oklahoma City bombing, the Timothy McVeigh bombing, affected right-wing attitudes towards political violence in the United States. And he, I believe, reported that they dampened them. It was sort of like, we peered into the abyss and it scared the hell out of us and we backed off. And this is a case study, so I don't know if this follows in general. I think it's actually a great question that we could look at empirically. It'd be a good thing to explore. So, great question. I just know this one example. I don't know the answer more fully than that.
Great, thank you. We are at the top of the hour, and I'm afraid I do have a hard stop, so we can't get to everybody's questions today. But as we mentioned previously, of course, you're welcome to email Gary or reach out to him otherwise, either by email or on Twitter. The gentleman is on Twitter. So with that, I'll just say thank you, Gary. Thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you everyone in our audience for joining us today as well.
My pleasure. Thank you.